All right, everybody, I have 6 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started for tonight's Pollinators 2.0 webinar. So thanks everybody for joining us. And again, welcome to the webinar this evening. We're excited to have everybody here. Again, my name is Kim Cole. I'm the Missouri Outreach Coordinator for Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever in Missouri. I'm going to help facilitate tonight's Pollinators 201 webinar. Before we jump into that and introduce our speakers and get into the presentation, there are a few virtual housekeeping details that I want to go over just so everybody kind of knows what to expect tonight if you haven't been in on one of our webinars before. So let's see if we can get that next one up. So we are recording tonight's presentation. We are going to make that available after the webinar, and that'll be up on the Missouri Quail Forever YouTube channel. We're also going to email that recording link out to everyone who registered. So for anyone who's here tonight, for those who registered for the webinar, look for a link with that recording to come to your email inbox soon. We also want to let everybody know your microphones are muted and your cameras are off. So everyone should only be able to see our presenters tonight, hear us talking and see our screens. We won't be able to see any of you all. So you can just sit back and relax and enjoy the presentation tonight. I do want to say with your microphones being muted, for those of you who do have questions throughout the webinar, you can go ahead and type those into the Q&A feature. So you can kind of see that little Q&A box in the middle. Just look for that and you can type your questions into there. Some of those we're going to answer as we go along. As the presenters are speaking, we'll answer some of those in the Q&A, but we are going to take some time at the end of the webinar tonight to read over some of those questions aloud and have our presenters answer some of those questions live for everybody. I do want to talk about our two presenters really quick. So we've got two really knowledgeable folks with us tonight. Bill White is the Community and Private Land Conservation Branch Chief from the Missouri Department of Conservation. And we also have Ethan Kleekamp. He is one of our Farm Bill wildlife biologists here with Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever in Missouri. So those are our two speakers tonight. And then real quick, just a little bit about the two organizations that, that all of us represent tonight. First is Quail Forever and Pheasants Forever. So our mission is to conserve quail, pheasants, and other wildlife through habitat improvements, public access, education, and conservation advocacy. We achieve that mission through several ways, but a lot of it's through the dedicated efforts of our members, our staff, our volunteer chapters, and numerous partners that we have that support us. And one of those partners that we work with quite often is the Missouri Department of Conservation. Just a little bit about them. Their mission is to protect and manage the fish, forest, and wildlife resources of the state, and to facilitate and provide opportunity for all citizens to use, enjoy, and learn about these resources. Their conservation goals are MDC takes care of nature, they connect people with nature, and they maintain public trust. So that's just a little bit, again, about our speakers and the organizations tonight. But what I'm going to do now is go ahead and pass the mic and I guess pass the screen over to Bill White as well. He's going to get us started for our Pollinators 201 presentation tonight. So take it away, Bill.
Thank you, Kim.
You're welcome.
Share my screen here. Well, as Kim said, I'm Bill White with the Missouri Department of Conservation, and I currently serve as our Community and Private Land Conservation Branch Chief. And I've been with the department for 33 years, and I'm not what you would call a bee expert. My expertise probably lies more in habitat restoration. But when we're restoring habitat for bees and other pollinators, it's also great bobwhite quail habitat, box turtles, deer, turkey, you name it. It's all good for the wildlife species we care about. Bees are pretty cool. They're one of those species that nobody knew a whole lot about until recently with the concern in the pollinator declines. And there's a lot of research. Almost every day I'm seeing something pop up, new research on either the habitat restoration aspects of helping pollinators or something about their life cycle. One of the things I do like to collect is bee memes and cartoons. There's not a whole lot of them out there. And I found this one to go along with the title of my presentation tonight. And when I was a little boy, I know my grandmother called me called something that I did the bee's knees. And I always wondered what it was, simply the best. And then, you know, when I got in junior high, became a teenager, she stopped saying that about me. And I don't know if it's because my knees were giving out or just what it was. So tonight we're going to talk about native bees for the most part, but again, this habitat will help a lot of other critters out there. Native pollinators are almost totally reliant on native plants. And then we're going to talk about some things to consider. And this is whether you are going to do some landscaping with native plants for pollinators, or if you're going to convert a larger field on your property. So one of the unique things about bees is that they evolved over, I think it's been 140 million years, they say, to collect pollen and nectar from the plants. And what's unique is the plants have also evolved to facilitate that the pollination that occurs when bees are collecting pollen and nectar. And one of the unique adaptations is they were built to actually pick up and carry the pollen from the flowers to their nest. And I don't think we can say that about any of the other pollinators, at least the ones that we have in Missouri. When they fly through the air, they build up an electrostatic charge on all the hairs on their bodies, and it immediately tracks pollen when they land on a flower. And some people some bees like the one on the right gather the loose pollen in a really thick mat of hair on their hind leg. Others, like the bumblebee and the honeybee, put a mixture of nectar and pollen together on a kind of a concave area on their hind leg that has some real stiff hairs over the top of it. So it looks like they've got a yellow ball of gum there as they're flying back to the nest. And then still others actually ingest the pollen and the nectar and take it back to their nest. So why native bees? It's because we're very dependent on them. In fact, if native bees disappeared, ecosystems would collapse, the human population would decline, because a lot of the food crops that we have out there, and there's a list there, tomatoes, peppers, squash, a lot of the food crops are pollinated by native bees and aren't touched by honeybees. Only native bees are pollinating tomatoes and peppers and squash and the like. So very important to our well-being, as well as the well-being of all of the fruit and seed-eating wildlife we have out there on the landscape. And you know, one of the big things we've seen, and they are even talking about 80 to 85 to 95% declines in some of these native bees that we have on our landscape. So it's more than just about honeybees. As far as pollination goes in Missouri, we have over 455 species of native bees, and new ones are being discovered each year. There's 50 some species of butterflies, probably close to 1,000, maybe over 1,000 species of moths that pollinate during the nighttime. Ants contribute, flies contribute, hummingbirds, beetles and bugs. And if you go to other places on the continent, we have bats that are actually contributing to pollination. And our native bees, the 455 species that are out there, come in all sorts of shapes, sizes, and coloration. Most of them are the size of a sweat bee. Most of them are black and yellow, or white and yellow, black, but we have some colorful ones that are iridescent green. So most of our bees nest in the ground, and like bobwhite quail, they need bare ground in order to survive. Most of them only travel 200 or 300 yards to get to a nectar or pollen source. If you think about honeybees, I think they've been documented flying over 6 miles from a hive to get to a pollen or nectar source. And some species of native bees are at least 5 times more efficient than honeybees on certain crops. So it doesn't take near as many native bees to pollinate a food crop as it does honeybees. And speaking of bees that nest in the ground, one of the families of bees that we have in Missouri, the bumblebees, there's 10 species. If you look there on that lower left diagram, number 1, a fertilized queen will hibernate over winter just below the surface of the ground. And this time of year, from March through probably the end of June, we've got those new queens emerging to start a nest. And that queen was fertilized in the fall, so they start laying fertilized eggs. They collect pollen and nectar. And if we don't have any wildflowers out there for them to collect the pollen and nectar from, that queen will die before she can start a nest. And then later on, as those new eggs, those first eggs that she lays hatch, those turn into workers and help her build a small colony, anywhere from 500 to 1,000 bumblebees in a colony, depending on the species. And they're collecting pollen and feeding the babies. And towards the end of summer in August, we have the new queens hatching out and the new males hatching out. They mate, and then that bumblebee queen repeats the cycle and goes and finds a place before killing frost to hibernate in the ground. This is an actual photo of a bumblebee nest. They are the only really social bumblebee we have, besides honeybees being social. But they have a very similar comb system. It's not near as neat and orderly as a honeybee, but they collect nectar and they store in these little wax-lined pots. You can see those to the left of that nest. At the very top of the nest, you can see that are some little pots that have the larvae in it, and those workers will feed those larvae the pollen and the nectar through that summer. So 70% of our bees nest in the ground, including bumblebees. And this is what the rest of the nest might look like on the left there. They dig a hole in the ground and they have different cells that they will deposit pollen and nectar in, and then lay an egg in that. And most of the ground nesting bees lay between 4 and 15 eggs, just depending on the species. Most of the time, it's just a single queen ground nesting bee that has one of these nests. In some cases, in some species, there'll be more than one queen, but they other than sharing a nest, they don't share any other type of duties. Another class of bees are our mason bees. They do not nest in the ground. They nest in cracks, hollow stems. In the lower left, you see some tubes that are made specially for them. We can manage our fields and our gardens so that we can provide those natural nesting cavities for this type of bee. Now they're a little bit different. If you can see that lower photo of that bee on the flower, they actually collect the pollen on their abdomens and carry at the bottom of their abdomens and carry it back to the nest that way. In the upper left-hand corner is a series of photos showing the progression of the bees as they lay their eggs, and it goes to a cocoon before it hatches. In the lower part of that diagram, you can see the yellow is the pollen that the bee has deposited in the nest, and then the little white thing there is an egg. And then they'll put in a mud partition and repeat the process. And they may lay up to, a dozen or so eggs in this manner in tubes. If you go to the next tube up on that diagram, you can see that egg is hatched into a grub or larvae. And in the top photo or top part of that diagram, that larvae has formed a cocoon, and they will stay in that cocoon until they hatch the next spring. And those things are pretty much waterproof. They're designed to breathe air and resist moisture. And this is fascinating to me. Somebody had actually laid a broken pin on their front porch or outside somewhere, and a mason bee actually set up shop inside of that broken pen. And so it gives you a good idea of what the pollen with a little egg sitting on top of it and the little mud partitions between that might look like in real life. Another class of bees that carry the pollen on their abdomen is the leafcutter bee. And you've probably seen this kind of damage on leaves in the upper left-hand corner, little neat little round circles. I've got some small red buds in my garden, and those things will be, the leaves will be riddled with these holes from the little leafcutter bees, but they use that to build those cells where they lay their eggs and deposit the pollen. And then about 10%-ish of the native bees out there are actually parasites, they call them cleptoparasites, and they will not worry about collecting pollen because they lay their eggs in other bees' nests, and their egg hatches out and kills the baby of the host bee, and then eats the pollen and nectar that's stored there and emerges the next spring. And a lot of people think, oh, that's terrible, they're killing our bees, but this is actually a sign of a healthy bee population. Their role is to keep any one species of bee from populating and stealing the nectar resources from all the other species of bees out there. About 1/3 of our bees are specialists. An example there on the left, the thistle longhorn bee. If we did not have native thistles, that bee would not exist. And you only see them on thistles in August and early September. We've got a lot of bees that specialize on sunflower type plants. So one thing we really want to stress to you is it takes native wildflowers for our native pollinators. Without this, we would have ecosystem collapse really because we would not have the bees out there. And so all of the exotics that are planted are causing problems for our populations of native bees and our butterflies and moths and the like. Most of these will not support our native pollinators. Most of them do not produce the pollen or the nectar that our bees can access, or in some cases they think it's nutritionally deficient or not enough of it to help our native pollinators. And then there was one study that was released, I think probably a year ago, that said there's evidence that pollen from improved varieties of our natives or ornamental flowers don't taste very good to a pollinator, so that's why they're not collecting it. Last summer, we piloted a program of surveying bumblebees in Missouri. And in the course of 2 months of collecting data, we found that over 73% of the flowers that those bumblebees that we surveyed were native. And then another 16% of them were non-native, but most of those were like the different clovers that we find on the landscape. And then the NA, the gray area, the 10%, were bumblebees that were not found on a flower when the survey was being conducted. They were out away from flowers or in a nest or something. One thing, especially an issue if you're going to do some landscaping with native wildflowers, is to pick the native flower and not a cultivar. In this example, the reddish one is a cultivar. It's a clone. It's actually a genetic freak. It has no pollen or nectar, and it's not attractive to bees as far as the coloration. The original species, the native species, is there on the left, purple coneflower. And we found where, again, the pollen and nectar is not accessible. The color of the flower isn't attractive to the pollinator, and so on. And if you're going to be planting in a native garden, you can watch out for species. These are cultivars. There'll be a fancy name in quotes, like the one on the left, sugar. and that's a warning that that is not a native plant and could possibly not be attractive to pollinators. So it's best to pick the actual original native plant if possible. Probably more important for caterpillars and butterflies and moths, native plants, almost 95%, I believe, of our native pollinating butterflies and moths require a native plant as a host that their caterpillars feed on. So again, the exotics out there are not doing those type of pollinators any favors. And the big question is, where do I find these native plants or seed? You can always go to grownative.org, and they have a resource page on there that lists all the native plant and seed dealers in the state of Missouri, and I think some of the surrounding states. So you can convert a farm field or a pasture, hayfield, or a part of a field to pollinators, plantings. You can convert portions of your yard. A lot of people will do something in the backyard. You can take a flower bed and convert it to natives, or you can substitute a native into an exotic flower bed where something has died out. But one of the top keys, we've got 455 plus species of bees and all the other pollinators out there. They will not survive if all you plant is one flower. And they need a diversity of species out there. They're emerging at different times of the year. They have different lengths to their mouth parts, different ways to collect pollen. The more diversity we can put into a planting, the better it's going to be, the more species of bees and other pollinators we're going to attract. So, and this is a yard. There's almost 2 months of blooming species right there. And so some of it's good for hummingbirds. Some of it the queen bumblebees are using in the spring. And then some of it, something like a hummingbird moth comes along and will use. So the more variety you can do, the better. And it's very important to have blooming plants throughout the season. You don't want to have a dearth of blooming plants during, let's say, May, or the opposite end of summer in August, because again, we've got, with the diversity of pollinators, we've got different species emerging all summer long, and need that summer-long blooms. So queen bees, it doesn't matter whether it's a bumblebee or some of the other species of bees we've got out there, need to have nectar sources available when they're emerging in spring. Again, you know, some of our bumblebees are emerging now. I've seen pictures of some mining bees on Facebook. The bees are getting out there now, and they will emerge throughout the summer. And so when they emerge, they need something to get the pollen and nectar from. And without that queen and, you know, the hope of raising another generation of bees in your yard or in your fields is going to die if that queen dies. So some of the plants that are really good in early spring and early summer are golden Alexander. It's a prairie plant. Red buckeye is a small shrub with red flowers on it. The spiderworts, any of the woodland flowers if you have a shaded area, any of the flowering native shrubs. I'm talking about things like ninebark and blackberry and wild plum and so on. And then it's not native, but the bumblebees still like it, some of the clovers. I would not recommend planting clovers and your native pollinator plants together, because the clovers can outcompete them. Some other things to think about, and again, this is going to sound like quail habitat, but edge feathering is important. We have bees that will actually nest in dead down woody material. They'll go into a place where a beetle or something has drilled a hole or a crack in the wood, and the mason bees, the leafcutter bees, and so on will nest in those kind of structures. And again, I mentioned it earlier, but bare ground for ground nesting bees is super important. Without that, you will lose out on being able to host that 70% of those species that nest in the ground. If you're in town, one of the issues with ground nesting bees in town is everything's covered up. It's covered up by concrete or a roof. We've got our pristine little lawns that don't have berry areas in them. They're beautiful grass, but not very beautiful to a bee. So we encourage people not to use mulch in the flower beds. That will keep bees usually from using bare ground. And there's ways to get around that. They've actually started recommending some of the clump forming sedges to interplant with your wildflowers in a landscaping situation, and they will help suppress weeds and keep the ground covered enough to suppress the weeds, but not enough to deter bees. And then I would encourage, if you're in the city limits and they allow burning, open burning, to burn litter in March or in the winter before the bees start emerging to get that bare ground. And especially, I think Ethan will talk about it a little later, to maintain your field plantings, it's essential that you do some burning to keep the diversity there, the bare ground there, but I would only burn 1/3 of that planting at a time. Some of the native flowers that we know are really good for native bees, and this isn't a comprehensive list. These are some of the top ones out there that we see use in Missouri, and it's on a recommendation list from a lot of other of our partners around the country. And don't forget the shrub component, because they are also valued, especially those that are blooming in the springtime. And if you don't have time to write all this down, don't worry about it, because Kim will have this on the website available. You can look at it again. So some of the key habitat practices we have out there. Make sure that if you're going to burn, do it in the wintertime. I wouldn't burn more than 1/3 to half of any field at one time, because if you burn the entire field, then you probably have destroyed a lot of the hollow stems that are out there for other bees to nest. So by burning 1/3 of the fields, you've got as much diversity out there as possible, plus you'll have as much diversity of bees and other pollinators out there. And a lot of our pollinators will overwinter in the leaf litter and on the ground, especially talking about moths and butterflies. So try not to burn the entire field at one time. Same way with light disking, burn 1/3 or disc 1/3 of your field at one time. Cool season grasses, especially things like fescue and brome, are very aggressive in a pollinator planting, and they will crowd out all that bare ground. So choose a chemical that will kill off the grass, but leave your wildflowers and forbs out there. Try and preserve hollow stems. One of the things you can do is mow high with a mower whenever you have weeds or blackberries or something like that, because you will have little bees come in and drill down into those hollow stems and make their nest in that in the following summer. And then edge feathering or down tree structures are important for that woody material for the type of bees that nest in that. And if you've ever seen one, a little green sweat bee, really iridescent green, that's the kind of stuff that they go to, is that dead down woody material. Even if it's half rotten, they are building their nests in that. So the things like the mason bees and the leafcutter bees are going to be nesting in pithy or hollow stems in nature, as shown in the photo at the top. And a lot of places market bee houses with tubes or drilled holes or whatever. You can do that on your own. It's typically not needed, because if you're managing your pollinator habitat right, you're making these pithy or hollow stems. And the list on the left shows things that are naturally used and sought out by these bees. And a lot of times the bee is not going to drill a hole into the side of that stem. They need the top of it broken out or a cut into the side of it. They just don't drill their own holes. If you're looking at one of the big box stores in town and they've got this fancy bee house, be very careful. A lot of those aren't built to the specs that are needed. Either the tubes are too big or they're too short. And so you will be impacting the bee population if you use these subpar bee houses that are on the market. The tubes need to be 4 to 6 inches long. And I think it's a quarter to, is it 5/16 or 3/8 in diameter. And a lot of these are a lot bigger than that and will be used by other things like wasps, but that's fine too. So I'm going to leave you with the key ingredients for pollinator habitat. So that diversity throughout the summer of flowering plants is extremely important. That bare ground component, like we would preach for bobwhite quail, is critical if you want that 70% of those bees out there in Missouri are ground nesters. They need that bare ground. And then the other big factor are the hollow stems standing throughout the winter. So you can't have one of these without the other. If we don't have the hollow stems, we're not going to see the leafcutter and the mason bees. If you don't have the diversity of flowers, there's no sense of putting up a bee house if you don't have the pollen and nectar source. So that's all I had. And the plan is that we're going to take questions at the very end. And if you've got questions in the meantime, please type them into the Q&A. And either somebody will answer them online or we'll answer them at the end of the program. So I'm going to turn it over to Ethan now.
Okay, I'm getting mine up and running here. Give me 1 second. Okay, that looked good, Kim. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us. Talking about this kind of pollinator habitat is something I really enjoy doing. And, you know, Bill gave us a great primer on some of the Pollinator 201, specifically about the bees. And now we'll get into kind of the mechanism, the brass tacks of how we might take sites like these and turn them into sites like these. One disclaimer I kind of want to issue is that, you know, I'll be sharing with you guys some of the best management practices and pulling from research and past experience, but there really is no substitute for meeting with the biologist on your property and coming up with a site-specific plan. There really are no cookie cutter approaches because, you know, we're talking about, you know, native landscapes here that, you know, have varied land uses, land use histories, ecological site descriptions. And so coming up with the specific plan for your particular property is going to be really important. And so I'm kind of going to walk you through how I would approach a visit like this with a landowner. And at the end of this, we're going to share some resources to help connect you with Farm Bill biologists like myself or MDC private lands conservationists that specialize in going out on farms and helping folks devise strategies like this. And so I'll specifically cover some info about site assessment, how we prepare a site for pollinator planting, assuming we are doing a planting, some seed mix considerations, planting methods, early maintenance, long-term management. And then I kind of down-weighted program information. Everything really in the first bit is going to be unrelated to programs, but I'm going to include a primer on it at the end because the economics do matter. So cost is, it can be a limiting factor that keeps people from jumping into this. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the avenues that you can take to get financial support. And so when we start with an assessment, the big inventory is what are you currently doing on the site? You know, we could do pollinator habitat on, you know, a lawn or row crop, hay fields, pasture, old fields like you see in the bottom, but each of those has different challenges and different opportunities through different programs as well. You'll see later on that, for instance, CRP would just be geared towards that row crop. Some other programs might be better fits for smaller acreages, and they all have, special needs and considerations that you have to take. A site like this, that had been row crop that clearly has some erosion issues, we know without a doubt that to get pollinator habitat here, it's going to need to be reseeded. Intensive cultivation, that native seed bank has been lost, and we're going to need to start from scratch. We have a lot of programs that help do that, fortunately. But then you have a site like this that is, a cool season hay field, and we don't really know. There are some mysteries lying under that, sod of grass out there. And so there's some clues that we can follow. And this is where a biologist could really help you look for certain indicator plants that might be rare or sensitive. That could be a clue that there's some kind of native seed bank intact. If it's kind of an odd area that's tough to access, maybe it has escaped cultivation in the past, so there might still be an intact seed bed. I've done work on a lot of hay fields that have terraces on it, so that's a pretty good indicator that it had been cropped, and we're probably going to need to start from scratch. But I'll show an example later on where we do take the management route. You don't always have to think immediately about putting money into expensive seed mixes. I know for a fact we could turn a site like this into good wildlife habitat without seeding anything new. It's a question of whether it would be good pollinator habitat or not. We might get a lot of annual weeds, but maybe not the type of flower diversity that we're wanting with pollinator habitat. So in addition to what your land currently looks like, you got to ask, what does the land want to be? Does the land's objectives match your objectives? You don't want to force a square peg in a round hole. They're, kind of an extreme example. You see this wet spot in this field down here, likely has hydric soils and would either be a wetland or a wet prairie, likely under historic or natural conditions. And so that community is going to be quite a bit different than the xeric, dry, highly erodible hillside that you see down there at the bottom. And so what a site really wants to be, if we play to its strengths, that can make our job a lot easier. And we have, a number of cool tools that help us kind of estimate what historic conditions were like and what would be the easiest path forward for folks. And these are tools that are publicly available, and we could probably share a link. But we could take a typical farm like this in Missouri that has some timber and row crop and pasture. We can map the soils. We can factor in information about landscape position and the historic disturbance intervals that we have information on. And then we can devise these ecological site descriptions. So you see here in this example, lush upland prairie versus till upland savanna, wet upland drainage way prairie. These are all kind of benchmarks or things that we can shoot for. And to give you an idea, and partly because I just think this is really cool, I'm going to share this with you. We could take the historic prairie in Missouri, knowing that prairie is not all created equally. They're very different shapes and forms of prairie. And when you break it down based on parent geologic material and kind of the moisture regime, like Paul Nelson did with this terrestrial natural communities in Missouri, you could see that you got quite a few different types, and they're all going to look a little bit different, be managed a little bit differently. When you factor in that landscape position, you see there's this huge proliferation of community types. And to give you an idea, in Ray County, where I was previously stationed before coming down here to Southwest Missouri, we have all these different prairie community types. And so that is really something that we use to build a plan to develop habitat on folks' property. And so you can have pollinator habitat that fits into each one of these different ecological site descriptions. They're all going to be a little bit different, but you're playing to the strengths of your property. If you decide that seeding, or, with the help of a biologist, perhaps decide that seeding is something that you're going to need to do, looking at the existing vegetation is really going to dictate what kind of site prep you're going to need to do. And so kind of the chip shot or the easiest avenue would be if you have something like soybean stubble, where it had been cropped for a number of years, and through that cropping and the chemical treatments on those crops, the competing weed vegetation has been managed and maintained. You have a seed bed that's ready to drill or broadcast right into. And so that's a pretty easy, pretty straightforward one. A site like that, after you pull the crops off in the fall, that winter you could probably plant. Some folks might recommend applying one herbicide application if you have trouble with really dense winter annuals that might, hinder a seeding. In the next spring, you might have a lot of competition. So some folks will recommend spraying once in the fall and then planting into that. Then you have kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, kind of this nightmarish scene on the left. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Sericea lespedeza, and that's an exotic invasive that we deal with all over the state. It's really problematic. It keeps us up at night. You see something like this, and I would want, at a minimum, 2 full growing seasons to do everything I could to get that weed under control as best I could, really to give the seedlings some sort of chance. You're not going to eradicate Sericea lespedeza, or really a lot of the invasives that we deal with, in a matter of a few years. I think some research was showing mature stands like this might take over 20 years to actually fully eradicate. And that's kind of heartbreaking news, but that's the reality of it. If you have this on your place, you're going to be married to treating it. And but you're fighting a good fight, and we're here to support you. And there's financial backing to do some of this site prep that is above and beyond what someone had to do, say, with the bean field. And so a case like this with the Sericea, multiple applications of remedy or pasture guard, those are typically what we use to treat this, and doing some kind of integrated approach with prescribed fire would really be great. And so maybe starting off with a burn in the spring, and you could probably treat that Sericea 2 or maybe 3 times during that growing season, and do it again the next year, and then maybe you'd be able to plant. The other example here, that sod-bound field in the lower right, we don't know what is under there. So it might be hiding good surprises. Like I mentioned earlier, there might be a native seed bank. There might be bad surprises. There might be all kinds of thistles and Johnson grass and Sericea. And so for sites like that, I really want folks to take a full growing season after the grass has been removed to just see what they're working with. And so a site like this, I might encourage folks to hay or graze it in the late summer or early fall. Treat it with a broad spectrum herbicide like a glyphosate. If there's enough residue to burn it sometime between then and the next spring. You'll see a lot of that grass, will still green back up. There'll be new seedlings that come back up in mature adult plants that you had missed. It might look, crispy, dead brown, killed that fall before, but that's almost never enough. Treating it a second time is really crucial. And then you'll see that following growing season, you will have flushed all kinds of untold species up out of the seed bank. And that's the time to treat anything that's problematic, rather than after you've already put some expensive seed down. We don't have the herbicide selectivity that we need to avoid damaging those in most cases. A lot of folks do ask, and they want to be able to get away without spraying. And I'd say it's tricky. It's something that I think we need more work to more research looking into this. Folks ask about solarization, which you see on the right with the clear plastic. And I see that used on small scale plantings, native landscaping. And I would say, there's still an environmental cost to that as well. You might be trying to avoid herbicides to think you're not doing as much damage. But if you're trying to do larger acres and acres with plastic like that, that's a tremendous amount of waste. Same with tillage. Some folks can get by with tillage, but know that that is a detriment to the soil health, and some erosion issues. If you're going one of these routes, not using herbicide, it's probably going to take longer. And again, you'd want to do some kind of integrated approach. So I would say tillage or fire with a cover crop that will kind of smother some of that regrowth, and maybe doing that for a couple of years. You might be able to get away without using herbicide, but most of the time we do use herbicide for this. But hopefully we continue to try to develop new ways as well. So Bill talked a little bit about your seed mix selection, some of the things that you're wanting to shoot for. It's really going to be dictated by your soil type and moisture levels, like we talked about earlier, what your particular site is like. Is it steep sloped? What type of planting method do you have in mind, and what your objectives are? And so kind of the base mix, the requirements that we like to use in a lot of our programs. For diversity, we want at least 20 forb species in that mix. We've really shifted away from referring to pounds per acre and more seeds per square foot. So if you work with any of us, you'll be seeing that. And that's just a better measure to get a better balanced and more kind of intentional seed mix on the ground. When we used to do pounds per acre, we found that that really selected for smaller seeded species. And so you might have one species out of 10 that took up half of the seed number out there. And so really skewed in one direction. Like I said, we want it balanced. So between 1 and 10% of the mix for any given species. And again, this will come down to your objectives, what kind of grass component you might want in it. And I'll touch on that briefly later. We're really selecting for perennial plants for really the longevity and the function that they give. So we don't want annuals or biennials more than about 10% of the mix. Again, is it a xeric, mesic, hydric site? If you really want to do a true restoration, you would probably be looking at purchasing yellow tag seed, which means it is sourced and from a genetic source within the state of Missouri, and that's all been certified. That will cost you more, but if you're committed to, like I said, a true restoration, you would be looking at getting the seed that is closest to what was growing there historically. Special considerations with your pollinator plot. Of course, there's a lot of excitement right now around monarch plantings, and so including milkweed in this instance would be fit into that special consideration. I could go quick over this because Bill really touched on some of this, but diversity really helps fill more niches. It will make your plot more resilient against invasion by things like Sericea or Johnson grass, more resilient to diseases, ultimately better for the soil because there are so many fungal associations with particular plants and families of plants, just like insect associations. And so diversity is king. And you might think 20 species is a lot, but that can get boring to look at after a couple of years. And so why not do 40, 50, 60 species? And you might be able to add some of those in as you go, but the more you can put down, the better off you're going to be. Bill talked about the asynchronicity. The grass component, it's not all that important for the insects themselves, the pollinators, but provides added structure. It's good fuel if you want to do a prescribed fire, which is really the best way to manage these sites. And it kind of helps prop stuff up throughout the year. And so we like a grass component, generally not more than about 25% of your seed mix. Bill touched on the woody cover component. Another thing to consider when laying out one of these plans, are you mitigating the pesticide risk that might be associated there? So if you're doing something adjacent to a crop field, you don't want to be pulling insects into this area just to subject them to overspray of any kind of insecticide or herbicide. And so there are steps that we take to mitigate this, both things that farmers can do, on field with their setbacks or the way they apply herbicides, and never want them applying insecticides nearby, but or things like windbreaks like you see on that photo there. As far as planting these seeds, the two real methods are broadcast seeding and drilling. And so people might squabble back and forth about which one they think is superior. I've seen really, really great stands from both. And I've seen stands that don't look so great from both as well. And so it depends on your comfort level with the equipment and what your site is like and what your site prep is like. And so if you're going to broadcast, that needs to happen during the dormant period. And whether you broadcast or drill, we do recommend that dormant period for these native wildflowers, because they really benefit from that cold, moist stratification to kind of crack open that seed coat, get them down to the right soil depth so that they can germinate on time, essentially that first year. And so in North Missouri, that dormant period is mid-November to mid-March. Southern Missouri, that ranges 1st of December to the end of February. You can drill in that spring period, and those dates are listed there. So now I'll show you a couple examples, these practices in action. And so this is a Ray County example. This was back in, I believe, February or March of 2019. We did this through the EQIP program, which we'll talk about later. So this was a soybean field. There was no site prep after harvest. And this landowner drilled the seed in early March. It was a monarch habitat planting right into this. And this is what we get the first year. And yeah, that's kind of how it looks. And a lot of people wonder, is this a failure? We see lots of volunteer ragweed and a cress in there and some pigweed, and none of the stuff that we planted is evident. And so, yeah, a lot of people call kind of distraught saying, where did I go wrong? And then you come out and you start peeking through some of that weed canopy, and you see some of our early establishing species from the mix, a lot of the annuals and biennials. Here you see Illinois bundleflower, some Coreopsis, black-eyed Susan, and some partridge pea. These are often your best quick indicator of if your seed was put down well. These will show up. And as far as kind of that first year management, this site, there's still a lot of sunlight getting down to that ground level. A site like this, at this stage, I wouldn't say it needs to be clipped or mowed at all. That weed competition isn't so runaway that it's going to shade out and smother out our little seedlings that are working on getting established. You might have a case like this, which I would say is kind of worst case scenario. This is another landowner that was a little late getting to it, and you could see that the foxtail really took off and put a canopy up. And so at this point, if you were to go in and clip that, you kind of run the risk of laying down a heavy thatch over top of those seedlings. And so this might be a site that's better off waiting until the dormant period and running a quick fire over it to eliminate that thatch for the next growing season. But one like this, that's really great wildlife habitat as it is. That's it's still in its infancy as far as pollinator habitat goes, but that's pretty darn good brood rearing cover for quail. Year 2, it's a totally different story. And so aren't we glad that we waited and didn't think we had to reseed? And so this is a really good looking year 2 plot. Some of them, it might be year 3 or 4 before they look like this. You can see it's still dominated by a few species, but pretty good diversity overall. And this will change again. Year 3, you'll probably get a little bit more grass starting to show up. And over time, more and more conservative species. Some of those species in your mix, you might not see for 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 years even. Some of them you might never see. I know Missouri Prairie Foundation did a really cool webinar a couple months back talking about the mycorrhizal fungi associations needed for some of these so-called conservative plant species. And so remember, this was going on a field that had been row cropped for many years. And so that soil isn't going to be healed immediately. So this plot is going to change over time. And so we're well on track. So yeah, we went from that in the first year to this in the second year. And so I'm really excited to see what that looks like next year. Kind of the other approach that we take to getting pollinator habitat, this farm looked like an absolute mess when I first went to it. You see the persimmon and autumn olive and cedar and the sericea, and your knee-jerk response is we just need to nuke this and start over. But then I was looking around and I was seeing these really highly conservative prairie plant species like the indigos and the prairie clovers. The one on the right, that downy blue gentian, is a pretty much a surefire sign that it is remnant prairie that had never been tilled before. And so that made us kind of change our approach. You don't want to go in and spray these things out because you might never be able to recreate this from seed. And so we went the long route. I'll talk a little bit about the programs we used, but it started with some cedar removal and then some prescribed fire in, I believe, March, then a treatment with remedy, maybe twice that first growing season, spot spraying where the sericea was worst. And then we're already seeing this really tremendous response from these, prairie plants. It's really great pollinator habitat. And so this is an example of, you might not need to put new seed down to get the result that you're after. As far as long-term management of these plots, Bill mentioned fire is going to be really critical. That's absolutely the best way and most economic way to clear some of that thatch, if applied at the right time of year, to thin out the grasses and the woody species that start to encroach. And so after a number of years, you can, if you can get a growing season burning sometime late summer, and into the fall, that can be a really great time to set back your grass and really stimulate your native forbs. But like Bill said, you want to do this on a rotation. You don't want to do it all at once. The strip disking tends to promote more of the annual flowers and kind of weedier species. Still great wildlife habitat. I think burning, for a pollinator plot would probably be the best thing that you can do. And like I said, with those disturbance factors, the timing, the intensity, how often you do it, when, how long you wait between time, are all going to kind of determine the results that you get. And so I'll kind of round this all out real quick, talking about some of the financial assistance that we have available. And so through MDC, USDA, and that's both the Farm Service Agency and the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and PFQF, we all have technical and financial assistance that we can give. And so the Conservation Reserve Program, this always generates lots and lots of questions. And so I will refer you all back to a webinar we did a couple of months ago, I think back in January, where we spent a whole hour just on this one. So go check that out. But there are lots of different practices within CRP. It's not just the grasses that you grew accustomed to seeing. It's now, we're requiring in many of these 20 native wildflower species. And so we've really kind of awoken to the benefit of forbs. And so through CRP, you can do these practices like a CP33 or a CP42 pollinator plot or prairie strips. You can see there kind of some of the basics with CRP. Again, I'm not going to go into really any more detail other than that's really geared towards acres that have been cropped. But if you don't have cropping history, there's still some avenues that we can take. So the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, we do a lot of pollinator habitat through this. The program at large, you can do kind of anything related to natural resources conservation through it, cover crops, rotational grazing. We do a lot of quail habitat, a lot of these pollinator and monarch plantings. And so rather than CRP that pays annually for those 10 or 15 years, EQIP just covers that practice. You complete either the one or the several practices that you got pre-approved for that are in your plan. You complete those and you get paid for those. And then, you just have to maintain that habitat for a set amount of time and not do anything to destroy it at all. And so EQIP is really great, really flexible. We like working with it. Conservation Stewardship Program is quite a different paradigm altogether, but this is kind of whole farm planning where you are being evaluated as a steward, as an operator. And so every piece of ground that you own or operate is going to be included in this assessment. If you meet the minimum threshold levels that we determined, you can get into the program and you can do a lot of really great things through it. Pollinator habitat, monarch plantings being some of those that have been really popular the last couple of years. And so like CRP, this is a program that gives you an annual payment. These contracts are 5 years long. You get paid based on that stewardship level that you were exhibiting when you first applied, and then additional funds for any practice that you want to do with the program. And so these can get pretty complicated, but we're starting to kind of get our head around it and working with it to do a lot of this kind of habitat. There are also non-competitive options. If you don't get into those that I just discussed or doesn't fit your farm, you can go this route. The Missouri Department of Conservation's Landowner and Community Assistance Program is first come, first serve. Kind of fills the gaps, like I mentioned that with the Farm Bill funding. And kind of an offshoot of that, the Habitat Challenge Grant is where we as PFQF and some other nonprofit organizations can contribute funds to this grant that MDC will match those dollars 1-to-1 to also fund projects in usually in close proximity to where those chapters are. And they're always for, things that benefit quail in our case, and this pollinator habitat is certainly that. And so we're wrapping up here, but I will point you up towards this virtual companion tour. Could be kind of a nice synthesis for you all to check out at some point. We filmed this at A.L. Gustin Golf Course last summer for a different webinar similar to this that we did. And so that's 7 or 8 minutes to kind of let you see what we were talking about. And so that's a pretty neat video. And like I said, help is available. So this is kind of the map of where our PFQF biologists are. And I think at this point, I'm going to be turning it back over to Kim to kind of close this out. So thanks a bunch, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ethan. And thank you, Bill, as well for your presentation. And thanks everybody for hanging out with us. We just have a couple more things to share, and then we're going to get into some questions. So like Ethan said, help is available. There's our Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever in Missouri staff map, and you can find that on our website too. Feel free to reach out to any of our Farm Bill biologists who are nearby you. They can help with this kind of stuff. You can also get help from the Missouri Department of Conservation too. So if you visit the MDC website, Ethan, if you want to shift to that next slide for me. it will show you, so there's just a quick view. If you go to mdc.mo.gov/contact-engage, you can go and find your local contact at, with the Missouri Department of Conservation as well. Just put in your county and look for the private land conservationist, and they're a staff member with MDC that can come out, similar as our biologists do, help with site visits, help with guidance, some of those cost share programs and navigating those. So definitely check with MDC, and then with your USDA offices as well. If you think cost share is the route you want to go, definitely check with your FSA office, and they can help with your eligibility and some of the enrollment questions and things like that. So, but we will go ahead and kick it over. We did have several questions come in. I know we're after 7 o'clock. So for those of you, if you want to stay and hang out with us for a few minutes, we will answer some of these questions live. Our presenters have been gracious enough to hang out a little bit later and see if we can get answers for everybody. So if you do have to leave us right now, that's okay. We'll catch this all in the recording. If you end up with questions for Bill or Ethan or myself, you can see all of our email addresses right there on the screen, and then you can find our website and all of our social media information and YouTube information on that screen right there too. So lots of ways to get in touch with us with questions. We're definitely all here to help. So feel free to reach out to us. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump into some of the questions that we got. And I think this first one's probably going to be for you, Bill. So the first one that we got, are honeybees compatible with native bees or vice versa?
That's a good question. There is some research out there showing that there is some competition, and some of it comes in the form of some of the honeybee diseases and parasites being spread through contact on flowers. Just like, you know, if you drink out of somebody's cup that's got a cold, you can transfer that cold to another person. In the same way with bees who are using the same flowers, they can transfer those diseases. So there is some evidence, unless you've got a honeybee hive set up on your pollinator plot, I wouldn't worry about it too much, but definitely concerned when you've got tens of thousands of honeybees trying to converge on the same plot that that's native bees are using.
Excellent. Thank you, Bill. This next one, Ethan, I think will be for you. You talked about it a little bit, but I think we might want to hit it again. We usually get questions about this one. What are some common chemicals for cool season grasses?
Yeah, so I would say glyphosate is the one that we use most common, and that's trade name Roundup. So folks are interested in that. And that's a broad spectrum herbicide. And so that's going to kill pretty much everything that it comes in contact with that is actively growing. And so as far as site prep before you do a planting, it can be pretty great. It's non-discriminate, like I said. You can also use glyphosate like that once your native plants have entered dormancy after a good hard killing frost late in the year. Things like fescue are still actively growing and still green and receptive to a chemical like that. There are some other ones, you know, that you might be able to use at certain times of year that are grass selective, like clethodim is a chemical that shouldn't really impact your broadleaves too much, that you might have success treating fescue, maybe brome with it, likely not warm season grasses. But yeah, generally for cool season grasses, we can use a broad spectrum herbicide because they grow in those shoulder seasons when your natives are dormant, and you can target them then. So it's a good question.
Awesome. Thank you for that answer. Let's see, Bill, here's a quick one for you. Is there a place to get the plans to build the bee houses?
Yes. So if you go Google bee house or bee nest, and the Xerces Society has a couple different pages on their website, and I'll just type the Xerces name in the chat so you know how that's spelled. But again, I typed that into my phone as we were sitting here, bee house and Xerces, and I came up with their page right away. So I will type that in here, how to spell that.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, Xerxes is a great one, and usually a quick Google search will get several results for those too. Let's see this one. I'll direct this one to you, Ethan. If wildflower seed was planted in fall of 2019 and they're still trying to establish a pollinator plot, how long should they wait before doing a burn?
Our general recommendation is to give it 2 or 3 growing seasons before you burn. That said, I know I showed you the example where there was that kind of rampant foxtail. Doing a dormant season burn you could get away with. Definitely no growing season burns for a little while, but yeah, if you want to clear some thatch and you want to just zip a head fire across that sometime, say, late December, January, when things are dormant, you can do that. But generally we say 2 or 3 growing seasons before you burn a new plot, unless you have just excessive weed pressure that you want to deal with. That's what I would advise.
Awesome, thank you. Bill, you're shaking your head. Did you want to add anything? You're just agreeing.
Yeah, well, I can back up what Ethan just said. I had a pollinator plot that I put in, and it came up dog hair thick with crabgrass mostly, and then matted down in the fall. And when you lifted up crabgrass, there was all sorts of forb seedlings underneath of it. So I burned it that following spring. I wasn't concerned about harming my grass species because they'll always come in and increase over time. And boy, did I have a pollinator plot the next summer, because I got all that trash off of it and allowed those seedlings to survive.
Awesome, thank you. Let's see, let me get back up to this next one. We had a couple come in that were really similar. One asked, how long should we wait before cutting down coneflower stems in the spring? And then someone else asked a similar question. They left their Joe Pye weed up all winter. When can they cut those back?
So you can go in right now if you've got straight stems standing still, and you can cut it down to knee high or maybe just a little bit shorter. And leave that 18 inches or whatever that is of stem setting there. That is what the bees that use cavities will nest in this summer. And your wildflower vegetation that's growing this summer should overtake that and cover that stubble of wildflower stems. So you can cut it at any time now, and there'll be leafcutter and mason bees emerging here probably next month, and looking for places to utilize.
Perfect, thank you. All right, let's see. This one, Ethan, I'll send it your way. I was under the impression that a late summer or fall burn would suppress grasses to allow more forb expression. My warm season grasses are getting out of control and I want to reduce them. When should I burn to enhance my pollinator habitat?
Yeah, I think you said it there. We generally recommend late summer, and throughout the fall. And so September, even October can be good times to burn. Finding good burn days might be difficult, but you might also find that that still might not do as much as you want. Sometimes those well-established, especially the taller warm season grasses, can be tough to thin. And so you might, Bill had kind of talked about some of that strip disking might be a way to chop some of that up a little bit. But yeah, I like the idea of first trying with a fire. And yeah, anytime, we want to try to get through the bulk of the nesting period, which, goes later into the summer than we previously thought. And so I would say September or October might be good months to try to shoot for, because you're letting it rest for that time when it's really critical for grassing birds.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see. Here's one. I have a lot of blackberries I need to get rid of, but I'm interested in how I get a third action. Any advice? Maybe is that just interested in how they're getting a third managed? You understand, if you know what they're going for in that one, maybe management wise, let me know. But I think they're wanting to get rid of some blackberries. Any recommendations for spray?
Well, the best way probably on blackberries is to spray them. If you're interested in doing something for pollinators, then yeah, maybe a third of the field each year, mow high. Yeah, I mean, you could even spray the blackberries and then come in and mow to create those nesting sites for the pollinators. But I'm not real sure what they were asking.
I'll jump in here also, and not necessarily on the management side of it, but know that some shrubby component in your pollinator plot can be really beneficial. It can really benefit lots of birds as well. And so when you get things like cedar and certain dogwoods and sumac, those can kind of run away from you and be problematic. But things like blackberries and wild plum, we generally like seeing stuff like that at some percentage of the field. So don't think that you automatically have to kill every woody that comes in. You can, try to manage them as best you can, and they give nice structure. Again, if they don't get away from you, it's gonna, might be tricky, but they're not always bad.
Cool. Thank you. Good point. All right, we've got one more. This one says, going back to Bill's answer about burning his pollinator plot to get rid of thatch in the spring. I have a second-year pollinator plot, and it is literally covered with thatch. In mid-Missouri, is it too late to try a spring burn?
It's awful close to being too late. If you can get into it in the next few days, but with all this rain that we've had, probably not. We've got wildflowers, the rosettes are greening up already. If you run a fire into those plants, you're probably going to either set them back or destroy them, depending on how old your planting is. You're probably not going to disturb any bees this early if you've got a thick layer of thatch. But I'd be concerned about setting back my, especially fresh young forbs, wildflowers.
Awesome. Thank you, Bill. Let's see. I've got one more that came in. I thought quail were done nesting about early to mid-June in Northwest Missouri. Do I need to wait for mowing?
Quail will nest through the end of September. The biggest hatch comes out in June, but if we've had a rainy spring, which we've seemed to be having a lot of anymore, they will have a pretty good hatch in August and or September. So no time in the growing seasons good for mowing for bobwhite quail, unless you do it really early or really late, like October.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, I think we've got through all the questions that came in. We had lots of comments from everybody that said thank you and they enjoyed the seminar. So excellent job, guys. Thanks for staying with us tonight, presenting, and then hanging out to answer those questions at the end. And just a quick reminder for those of you that are still hanging on with us, again, all of our emails are up on the screen. So if you have questions that you think of after tonight's webinar, feel free to reach out to Ethan or to Bill or myself. We are recording this and we're going to share that recording. I'll be emailing that out to everybody who registered. So if you're here tonight, you're registered and you'll get that link from us. I'll probably send that out sometime tomorrow. And it'll be on our Missouri Quail Forever page as well. But again, if anybody has questions, feel free to reach out to us. We appreciate everybody joining us tonight for this Pollinators 201 webinar. Appreciate everybody sending your questions in, and everybody have a good night. Thanks so much.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.